Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to another literary journey through time. Today I'm going to tell you a story that transports us to 19th century Spain, where marriages were arranged like business deals and women lived in the shadows of men. But this is the story of a woman who, even though considered invisible by society, discovered that true love can flourish in the most unexpected places. A narrative about dignity, overcoming adversity, and how the beauty of the soul can surpass any external mark. Where are you listening from today? Write in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave that like to help me continue bringing these moving stories to you. Year 1853. Location: Hacienda Voldemar, Castilla la Vieja, Spain. The spring of 1853 arrived at Hacienda Voldemar like a whisper of hope over the arid lands of Castilla la Vieja. The almond trees bloomed in white cascades, and the wind carried the aroma of wild lavender that grew in the abandoned fields. It was in this setting of rebirth that two sisters walked through the morning garden, each carrying the weight of destinies as different as their appearances. Doña Visitación, at 23, moved like a dance among the rose bushes. Her honey-golden hair captured every ray of sun, and her sky-blue muslin dress rippled with the grace of one who knew she was admired. Each of her gestures was calculated to enchant, each smile a promise of happiness that she had never needed to question whether she could fulfill. Behind her, with more cautious but no less determined steps, walked Doña Remedios. At 26, she carried on her face a dark mark that extended from her left temple to her cheekbone, as if nature had decided to mark her difference since birth. A slight limp in her right leg, a reminder of a childhood fever that had nearly taken her, made her movements more measured, more thoughtful. But it was Remedios's hands that revealed her true nature, hands that knew the earth, that knew how to make life sprout where others saw only stone. At that moment, she knelt beside a bed of camellias, whispering words that seemed like songs to the flowers that opened under her care. "Remedios, leave those flowers and come here," called Visitación, her musical voice echoing through the courtyard. "Mama wants to speak with us about something important." Doña Asunción de Voldemar, the widowed countess, awaited them on the marble veranda where she took her morning chocolate. At 52, she still maintained the haughty posture of one born to command, although financial worries were beginning to carve premature wrinkles around her grey eyes. "Girls," her voice trembled slightly, "I received a letter that may change our destinies. Don Evaristo de Villacorta, Marquis de los Llanos, is on his way. He comes seeking a wife." The silence that followed was heavy as the air before a storm. Visitación radiated a triumphant smile. Already imagining herself with the title of Marchioness, Remedios merely lowered her eyes to her earth-stained hands, knowing, with the painful certainty of the invisible, that she would never be considered. What kind of man would this Marquis be, who sought a wife like one choosing cattle at market? Don Evaristo de Villacorta arrived on an afternoon of leaden sky, when clouds accumulated over the hacienda like omens. His black carriage with golden coat of arms traveled the poplar-lined avenue with the solemnity of a funeral procession, and even the horses seemed to move with apprehension. From the man who descended from it at 38 years old emanated a coldness that contrasted with the growing warmth of spring. Tall, broad-shouldered, he dressed entirely in black, as if in perpetual mourning. His dark hair, already speckled, with silver at the temples, was impeccably groomed, and his eyes, of a brown so deep they seemed like starless night, revealed a soul that had seen too much and felt too little. The sisters observed him from the second-floor window. Visitación frantically adjusted her hair and pinched her cheeks to give them color, while Remedios remained in the shadows, as she always did when important visitors arrived. "He's more imposing than I expected," whispered Visitación, her eyes shining with poorly disguised ambition. "He's sadder," murmured Remedios, perceiving something her sister didn't see, the way his shoulders curved slightly, as if carrying the weight of secrets too heavy for one man alone. Doña Asunción received him in the main hall, where portraits of Voldemar ancestors watched in silence. The introductions were formal, courteous, empty as abandoned houses. Don Evaristo kissed the hands of both young women with the same absence of interest, but Remedios noticed that his eyes lingered a second longer on her, not with admiration, but with an almost scientific curiosity. During dinner, he spoke little. His responses were precise, educated, devoid of any human warmth. Visitacion tried to captivate him with crystalline laughter and charming stories about life at the hacienda, but he listened to her with the same attention he would give to the sound of rain. "Are Valdemar's lands prosperous?" he asked suddenly, cutting through one of Visitacion's anecdotes. "Sufficiently," responded Doña Asunción, trying to hide the lie behind a tense smile. It was then that Don Evaristo addressed Remedios directly. "And you, señorita, what do you do to occupy your days?" All eyes turned to her. Remedios felt the blush rise to her cheeks, but responded with a serene voice. "I tend the garden, Señor Marquis, and I read." "Read," he repeated, and for the first time something like genuine interest crossed his features. "What kind of books?" "History, philosophy, sometimes poetry." An uncomfortable silence took hold of the table. Doña Asunción shot her daughter a look of reproof. Proper young ladies shouldn't show erudition before men. But Don Evaristo merely nodded, as if he had confirmed some secret suspicion. What strange calculation was processing behind those nocturnal eyes? The following morning dawned with an unnatural silence. Even the birds seemed suspended in expectation, as if all of nature sensed that something definitive was about to happen. Don Evaristo had requested a private audience with Doña Asunción after breakfast, and the entire house held its breath. Visitación spent the entire morning preparing. She chose her most elegant dress, rose-colored silk with French lace, and asked the maid to arrange her hair in elaborate curls. She perfumed herself with rose water and rehearsed before the mirror the expressions of modest surprise she would use when she received the marriage proposal. Remedios, for her part, took refuge in the garden. Kneeling among the camellias, her hands worked the earth with mechanical movements while her mind wandered. She knew that in a few hours she would witness her sister's triumph, the confirmation that some women were born to be chosen and others to be forgotten. The pain she felt wasn't envy. It was a deeper melancholy, the resignation of one who accepts their place in the shadows. The midday sun beat down hard when the family gathered in the central courtyard for the afternoon meal. A table had been set under the Moorish arcades, with white linen tablecloth and the family's finest porcelain. Crystal grapes sparkled with port wine, and trays of convent sweets exhaled the aroma of cinnamon and honey. Don Evaristo arrived punctually, dressed in his habitual sobriety. His movements were controlled, his gestures measured, like those of an actor who perfectly knows his role. He sat at the head of the table, accepted a glass of wine, and observed the three women with that analytical gaze that had already become his trademark. Doña Asunción tried to contain her anxiety behind forced smiles. Visitation radiated luminous confidence, certain that the choice was obvious. Remedios kept her eyes lowered, focused on cutting a pear with unnecessary precision. "Doña Asunción," said Don Evaristo finally, setting down his glass with a small sound that echoed like a bell, "I come to formally request your daughter's hand in marriage." The silence was absolute. Visitación straightened up, a smile already forming on her rosy lips. "I request the hand of Doña Remedios." The world stopped. The words hung suspended in the air like impossible objects, defying gravity and logic. Visitación paled until she was white as the table's tablecloth. Doña Asunción opened and closed her mouth several times, like a fish out of water. Remedios slowly raised her eyes, meeting his for the first time since they had met. On his face there was no emotion whatsoever, only a cold determination that admitted no questioning. Began Doña Asunción, struggling to find words. "I accept," said Remedios, her serene voice cutting through the thick air. "I accept your proposal, Don Evaristo." He nodded once, as if closing a cattle deal. But why the imperfect daughter, when he could have had the family jewel? The afternoon that followed the marriage proposal passed like a restless dream. Doña Asunción locked herself in her chambers with a sudden headache, while Visitación disappeared through the house corridors, leaving behind only the echo of muffled sobs. The servants whispered in corners, trying to understand the Marquise's inexplicable choice. Don Evaristo requested a private conversation with Remedios. They met in the library, a room that rarely received visitors. Its walls lined with dusty books, and the aroma of aged leather created an atmosphere of guarded secrets and unspoken words. She entered with her measured steps, her grey wool dress whispering against the stone floor. He awaited her standing by the window, hands crossed, behind his back, observing the fields that extended to the horizon. The evening light created a golden outline around his rigid figure. "Please sit," he said without turning, indicating a faded velvet armchair. Remedios obeyed, maintaining the upright posture she had learned since childhood. Her hands rested in her lap, interlaced with a tranquility that hid the inner turmoil. She knew she was about to hear the truth, and truth, however painful, had always seemed preferable to illusions. Don Evaristo finally turned to her. His eyes studied her with that analytical coldness that had already become familiar, as if she were a map he was trying to decipher. "I need you to understand the terms of this agreement," he began, his voice as neutral as a notary reading a will. "I do not seek love, Doña Remedios, nor passion nor romanticism. I seek a suitable companion for my social position and a competent administrator for my house." Each word fell like a stone in still waters, creating waves that expanded in circles of painful understanding. "I chose you because you are not dangerous," he continued, walking slowly around the room. "You don't try to please, you don't impose yourself. You have no illusions about feelings that don't exist. You understand what it is to live in the shadows and won't demand from me lights I cannot offer." Remedios absorbed his words in silence. There was no surprise on her face, only a dignified resignation that spoke of a lifetime learning to accept uncomfortable truths. "And what do you expect from me, Señor Marquis?" she asked, her voice firm despite the almost imperceptible tremor. "Mutual respect, discretion, that you manage the house well and receive my guests with the courtesy due to the title you will bear. Nothing more." He stopped before her, and for a moment something almost human crossed his gaze. "But I also promise you something in return. I will never lie about what I feel or fail to feel. I would never deceive you with false demonstrations of affection." Remedios raised her eyes to meet his. In the brutal honesty of those words, she recognized a strange form of kindness, the kindness of one who doesn't feed vain hopes. "I thank you for your sincerity, Don Evaristo, and I accept your terms." He nodded as if closing a successful business deal, but when he headed toward the door, she called to him softly, "May I ask you a question?" He stopped but didn't turn around. "Why not my sister? She is everything a man could desire." The answer came after a long pause. "Because the beauty that everyone sees bores me, and the beauty that no one sees, that intrigues me." What? Mystery would hide behind this preference for the invisible. The days preceding the wedding passed like a macabre dance of courtesies and subtle poisons. Visitación, recovered from the initial shock, began a silent campaign of humiliations that flowed like poisoned honey through the hacienda's corridors. During breakfast, she offered to accompany Don Evaristo on his morning rides, claiming that Remedios certainly couldn't keep up the pace with her condition. At meals, she made apparently innocent comments about how some women were born to be useful instead of ornamental, always with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes. Remedios endured everything with the patience of one who had learned since early age that reacting only fed others' cruelty. She continued her usual tasks, tending the garden, reading in the library, embroidering by her room's window. But Don Evaristo observed and saw. It was during a particularly tense lunch that the situation reached its limit. Visitación, with her musical voice, was describing to the Marquis the qualities a Marchioness should possess. "Of course, beauty and charm are important," she said, delicately stirring her endive salad. "But I believe the most essential thing is the ability to represent one's husband well in society, to be a worthy ornament of his position." She made a calculated pause, before adding with false concern, "I hope Remedios doesn't feel overwhelmed with so many social responsibilities. Perhaps it would be better if she limited herself to domestic duties, where her practical abilities would be more useful. The silence that followed was cutting as a blade. Doña Asunción pretended to concentrate on her plate, unable to intervene. Remedios kept her eyes lowered, but her hands trembled slightly as she held her fork. Don Evaristo set down his utensils with deliberate precision. When he spoke, his voice had the mortal coldness of steel. Doña Visitación. Allow me to clarify something. What sustains a noble lineage is not ornaments but substance. What is truly tedious is frivolity without purpose, an empty decoration that crumbles in the first wind. Visitación paled, but he continued implacable. I prefer a woman who understands the value of silence and dignity to one who confuses noise with importance. The beauty that everyone sees is as common as flowers that bloom in spring and die in winter. The beauty that few perceive, that endures. The look he directed at Remedios contained something she had never expected to see, an austere form of approval, perhaps even protection. Visitación rose from the table abruptly, murmured an excuse about a headache and withdrew, leaving behind a trail of perfume and humiliation. Doña Asunción also withdrew, claiming urgent tasks, until only the two remained in the sunny dining room. You didn't need to defend her, said Remedios softly, breaking the silence. I defended what is mine, he replied, but something in the way he pronounced mine made her heart accelerate in an unexpected way. What transformation was beginning to germinate in that heart of stone? After the incident at lunch, a peculiar form of communication was established between Don Evaristo and Remedios, a language made of subtle gestures, strategically placed objects, and glances that lasted a second longer than courtesy required. It began the next day, when Remedios found in her usual library chair a book that hadn't been there before. Rimas, by Gustavo Adolfo Bequet, opened to a specific page where a small oak leaf served as a bookmark. The poem spoke of souls that recognize each other in silence, and she understood that this was more than coincidence. 2 days later, Don Evaristo found on his desk a small bouquet of lavender and rosemary, tied with a blue silk thread. The herbs had been harvested from the garden she tended with such care, and the subtle aroma remained on his papers throughout the week, like a silent but constant presence. The next morning, a note appeared under Remedios's room door. The handwriting was firm, masculine, but the words had an unexpected delicacy. Flowers know how to grow even in stones. Perhaps I have been blind for too long. She kept the note between the pages of her prayer book, along with the oak leaf that had become precious as a relic. The exchange of symbols continued through the days preceding the wedding. A musical, score left on the piano, a melody he played on lonely nights, and that she too had now learned. A smooth riverstone, polished by water and time that he found on his plate during breakfast, accompanied by a note. Some beauties only reveal themselves to patience. It was on a rainy afternoon, when the first summer thunderstorms roared over the hacienda, that the most significant message arrived. Remedios found it on her sewing cushion, a folded paper where a single sentence was written with almost reverent care. You are not insignificant. I am the one who didn't know how to look. Her hands trembled as she held the paper. It wasn't a declaration of love. Don Evaristo had been clear about the nature of his feelings. But it was recognition, an admission that she existed, that she possessed value others had failed to perceive. That night she left her response in the library, marking a specific passage from Don Quixote. I know who I am, and I know I can be. The words Cervantes had put in his hero's mouth when he affirmed his identity against a world that saw him as mad. When Don Evaristo found the open book, he remained a long time contemplating the passage. Something was changing between them. Not love, perhaps, but a mutual recognition that was almost as precious. In the hacienda windows, rain streamed like tears. The sky cried for hearts that were slowly learning to know each other. What other secrets would be revealed before they spoke their vows? The wedding day dawned wrapped in a golden mist that softened the contours of the Castilian landscape. The family chapel, small and austere as a whispered prayer, had been adorned only with olive branches and white camellias, the flowers Remedios cultivated with such care. There were no crowds, no pomp, only the necessary people to make legal that union born of necessity and walking toward unknown territories. Father Don Alfonso, an elderly man whose hands trembled slightly over the missal, Doña Asuncion, dressed in dark purple, a few house servants, and Visitacion, who had come with a marble smile and eyes that shone with contained tears. Remedios entered the chapel, wearing a dress of raw satin without embroidery or jewels, except for the cameo that had belonged to her grandmother. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple chignon, adorned only with a small sprig of rosemary, symbol of remembrance. In her hands she carried a modest bouquet of lavender and wild roses. Don Evaristo awaited her before the altar, dressed in his usual black attire, but there was something different in his posture. When she approached with her measured steps, he extended his hand to help her climb the 2 stone steps, and the gesture, though simple, carried a courtesy that went beyond mere formality. The priest's words echoed in the silent chapel like echoes of centuries of similar promises. To love and honor, in joy and sorrow, in sickness and health. Phrases that had been repeated thousands of times, but that here acquired a specific weight, a gravity that neither of them had expected. When the moment for vows came, Remedios raised her eyes to meet his. Her voice, clear and serene, pronounced the words with a dignity that transformed the contract into something almost sacred. I accept you, Evaristo, as husband, promising you fidelity, respect, and the peace that a good wife should bring to the home. His response came in a lower voice, but each word was pronounced with deliberate care. I accept you, Remedios, as wife, promising you protection, honor, and the respect you deserve. They weren't words of passion, but there was in them a solemnity that touched something deeper than desire. It was the recognition of 2 souls who committed to sharing the weight of existence. The kiss that sealed the union was chaste, a mere touching of lips that lasted only an instant. But when they separated, something had changed in both their gazes, a mutual acceptance that went beyond the terms they had negotiated. The celebration that followed was simple, a meal in the main dining room, port wine, convent sweets, and conversations punctuated by silences that were no longer awkward, but contemplative. When night fell and it was time to retire, Don Evaristo accompanied his new wife to the door of her chambers. There he respectfully kissed her hand and murmured, "Good night, Marchioness. Rest well." Remedios remained for a long time by her room's window, contemplating the gardens bathed in moonlight. She was no longer the forgotten daughter of Voldemar. She was now Doña Remedios de Villacorta, Marchioness de los Llanos. The title weighed on her shoulders like a golden mantle, but also like a responsibility she was determined to honor. In the corridor shadows, Don Evaristo also remained awake, questioning himself about the strange feelings beginning to germinate in his chest. What surprises would that union born of convenience reserve? A week after the wedding, when the last echoes of the ceremony still whispered through the hacienda corridors, Remedios was struck by a sudden fever that swept away her strength like a storm devastates a wheat field. It began with a headache during breakfast, progressed to chills that no blanket could appease, and by nightfall she burned in delirium in a bed that had become a bed of torments. Don Evaristo was informed by the village doctor, an elderly man of few words, that the illness could be serious. It wasn't uncommon for such fevers to take patients, especially those already weakened by other conditions. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. That night, defying all social conventions, Don Evaristo installed an armchair beside Remedios's bed. Doña Asuncion protested, claiming it wasn't proper for a man to care for a sick woman, but he dismissed her with a coldness that admitted no discussion. "She is my wife," he said simply. "It is my responsibility." For 3 days and 3 nights, he didn't leave the room. He changed the cold compresses on her forehead when fever rose, held her hands when chills made her tremble, like a leaf in the wind, and whispered words of encouragement when she murmured incoherencies in her delirium. It was on the second night, when fever reached its peak and Remedios called for her mother dead for years, that something broke in Don Evaristo's stone chest. Seeing her so fragile, so vulnerable, he understood that this woman who had accepted, without illusions, had conquered a space in his soul he thought was forever closed. "Don't leave me," he whispered, holding her burning hand. "We still have so much time ahead." They were words pronounced in darkness, witnessed only by shadows, dancing on the wall, but they carried a weight of truth that surprised him. On the third morning, the fever broke like a wave dissolving on the beach. Remedios opened her eyes, still weak but lucid, and found his face marked by lack of sleep and worry. "You stayed," she said, her voice barely a thread of sound. "I stayed," he confirmed, and there was in his response a simplicity that contained worlds. "Why?" The question floated between them like a butterfly seeking where to land. Don Evaristo looked at his own hands, hands that had cared for her with a tenderness he didn't know he possessed. "Because I discovered that you matter to me, more than I thought possible." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something perhaps more precious, the recognition that two human beings had found in each other something worthy of care, protection, permanence. Remedios closed her eyes, but a small smile touched her pale lips. For the first time in her life, someone had chosen to stay. How many other discoveries awaited them in that marriage that had begun as business and was slowly transforming into something else? Remedios's convalescence brought with it a subtle but perceptible change in the Hacienda's dynamics. Don Evaristo, who before limited himself to necessary courtesies, began to seek her company with a naturalness that surprised everyone, including himself. It began with shared meals. Instead of eating in silence, he began asking questions about the books she read, about the plants she cultivated, about the small details of life that before had seemed insignificant to him. He discovered that she possessed well-formed opinions about history and philosophy, and that her apparent submission hid a sharp and observant mind. "What do you think about the changes happening in Europe?" he asked one morning, while they had breakfast on the veranda. Remedios delicately set down her chocolate cup. "I believe we are living through the end of an era, Don Evaristo. Industrialization. And Republican ideas will forever change the way we live. Nobility titles begin to lose meaning when wealth can be created through inventiveness and work." The response revealed a political understanding he didn't expect to find in a woman raised in the traditions of rural aristocracy. "And does this bother you?" he asked, genuinely curious. "No, I believe each person should find their value in themselves, not in the titles they carry or the beauty they possess." The words hung suspended between them like a disguised confession. Don Evaristo understood that she spoke from her own experience, a lifetime learning to find dignity where others saw only imperfections. The walks also became habitual. Initially, he accompanied her only to ensure she didn't tire too much during recovery. But soon he discovered he enjoyed hearing her talk about plants, about nature's cycles, about the small miracles that happened every day in the garden. "This variety of camellia," she would say, delicately caressing a pink flower, "blooms only at winter's end. It's as if it saves all its beauty for the moment when we most need hope." Don Evaristo observed not only the flowers, but the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of something she loved. There was a passion there, an intensity that contrasted with her apparent placidity. It was on an August afternoon, when they walked through fields of golden wheat, that the first real confession happened. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with tones of amber and crimson, and a gentle breeze carried the aroma of lavender from distant fields. "Remedios," he said, suddenly stopping beside a centennial oak, "I need to tell you something." She turned to him, and the golden light of evening softened the mark on her face, transforming it into an almost imperceptible shadow. "When I chose you as wife, I thought it would be safe, that you wouldn't affect me, that I could keep my heart protected." He paused, struggling with words he had never known how to pronounce. "But I discovered that you disturb me more than I can bear." The wind whispered among the oak leaves, as if nature itself held its breath to hear that confession. "How so?" she asked softly. "Your silences tell me more than other people's chatter. Your silent strength fascinates me, and I discovered that—" He hesitated, as if the words were precious stones he was reluctant to give away. "I discovered that I need you in a way I don't understand." Remedios felt tears sting her eyes. They weren't the romantic words Visitacion had hoped to hear from a suitor, but they were true, and truth had always seemed more precious to her than fantasy. "Me too," she whispered. "I need you too." It was then that he extended his hand to lightly touch her face, his fingers tracing a caress that was both reverent and hesitant. And when they kissed there, under the oak gilded by the setting sun, it was with a tenderness born not of passion but of deep recognition. Two souls that had found in each other a home. What other transformations would that nascent love bring to their lives? The month of September brought with it the announcement that made the entire province vibrate with expectation. Visitacion would organize a grand ball in honor of the newlyweds. The news reached them on a golden morning, carried by a servant who brought the invitation written in flowery calligraphy and perfumed with rose water. Remedios received the news with poorly disguised apprehension. She knew her sister well, and knew that behind that apparent courtesy hid a carefully architected plan. Don Evaristo, observing the worry lines that formed on his wife's forehead, gently asked about her concerns. "Visitacion never does anything without ulterior motives," confessed Remedios as they walked through the camellia garden. "I fear this ball is more an opportunity for humiliation than a celebration." "Then we won't go," he said simply. The response surprised her, but it would be a terrible discourtesy. "I prefer to be considered discourteous than to allow them to hurt you." The protection in his words warmed Remedios's heart like an embrace, but her dignity, forged in years of challenges, didn't allow her to flee. "No. We'll go, and we'll show everyone that this marriage is not a cause for pity but for celebration." The night of the ball arrived on a Friday with a full moon. The Voldemar house had been transformed, flowers everywhere, wax candles slowly melting in silver candlesticks, and a quartet of musicians from Madrid to animate the festivities. Guests arrived in elegant carriages, bringing with them the buzz of Castilian high society. Remedios prepared herself with special care. She chose a dark blue velvet dress, a color that enhanced her brown eyes and disguised her limp. Her hair was arranged in an elegant hairstyle, adorned only with a small pearl brooch. She wasn't the dazzling beauty of Visitacion, but there was a dignity in her appearance that spoke of substance and character. Don Evaristo awaited her at the foot of the stairs, impeccable in his gala attire. When she descended the steps with her measured grace, something changed in his expression. A recognition of the beauty that had always been there, waiting to be seen. "You look beautiful," he murmured, offering her his arm. The ball was at its height when they arrived. Visitacion, resplendent in a golden silk dress that had cost a fortune, received guests' compliments like a queen in her court. When she saw the couple, her smile widened but didn't reach her eyes. "Dear sister," she exclaimed, kissing Remedios's cheeks with exaggerated affection. "How wonderful to have you here, and Don Evaristo as always so elegant." The first hours passed without major incidents. Remedios conversed discreetly with guests, her irreproachable education compensating for any lack of effusive charm. Don Evaristo remained by her side, a silent shield against curious looks and whispered comments. It was during supper that Visitacion struck her blow. With the room silent and all eyes turned to her, she raised her champagne glass in an apparently affectionate toast. "I want to toast the happy couple. My dear sister Remedios has always been so practical, so useful. And now she's found a husband who values those domestic qualities. Although some people say a marriage without children isn't complete, I'm sure Don Evaristo will find other ways to be happy." The poison in the words was distilled with mastery. The insinuation about Remedios's supposed infertility, a rumor, Visitacion had carefully spread, hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The silence that followed was deadly. Remedios paled but maintained her upright posture. Doña Asunción pretended not to have heard. Guests looked at each other, embarrassed by the poorly disguised malice. It was then that Don Evaristo slowly stood up. His fury was terrible precisely because it was controlled, like a storm contained in a crystal bottle. He walked to where Remedios sat, and before all the guests, extended his hand to her. "My lady, would you grant me the next dance?" The simple gesture contained multitudes. It was an invitation, a declaration, an act of defiance and protection. When Remedios placed her hand in his, it was as if they sealed a pact before the world. On the dance floor, under the astonished gaze of guests, they danced a slow and elegant waltz. Don Evaristo held his wife as if she were made of the most delicate crystal, but his eyes burned with an intensity that spoke of feelings that had finally found voice. "You don't need to do this for me," whispered Remedios. "I don't do it for you," he replied, spinning her with perfect grace. "I do it because you are my wife, and I'm proud of that." When the music ended, he delicately kissed her hand, a gesture that echoed through the silent ballroom, like a public declaration of devotion. What other revelations would that night still reserve for the two hearts learning to love? After the ball, the return journey to the hacienda passed in contemplative silence. The carriage swayed gently along the dirt roads, and the full moon poured its silver light over the sleeping fields of Castilla. Remedios observed the landscape through the window, still processing the night's events, while Don Evaristo kept his gaze fixed on his own hands. It was only when they reached the hacienda that he broke the silence. "Would you like to accompany me to the library? There's something I need to tell you." The library awaited them, wrapped in golden penumbra. Don Evaristo lit some candles, and the dancing light created intimate shadows on the shelves full of old books. The aroma of leather and aged paper mixed with the subtle perfume of lavender that Remedios always carried with her. She settled into the velvet armchair where she had sat during their first serious conversation, but now the atmosphere was completely different. There was no longer the coldness of a commercial agreement, but a nascent intimacy that hung between them like a promise. Don Evaristo remained standing by the unlit fireplace, visibly struggling with words that wanted to emerge but found resistance, in decades of emotional control. His hands opened and closed nervously, as if he were trying to hold water. "Remedios," he began, his voice lower than usual, "I need to confess something that has tormented me since our conversation under the oak." She waited in silence, recognizing the moment as one of those that define the course of a life. "When I told you I chose you for being safe, I lied. Or rather, I told only part of the truth." He turned to face her, and his eyes contained a vulnerability she had never seen before. "I chose you out of fear, yes, but not fear that you would affect me, fear that you wouldn't affect me enough." The words fell in the silent library like stones in still water, creating waves of understanding that expanded in ever larger circles. "I don't understand," she whispered. "All my life I've kept people at a distance after—" He hesitated as if stepping on sacred ground. "After losing my first wife in childbirth 15 years ago, I swore I would never again allow anyone to get close enough to hurt me. I thought I could marry again for convenience, keep my heart protected." The revelation hit Remedios like lightning. Suddenly his coldness, his preference for the safe, gained a completely new meaning. It wasn't cruelty, but self-protection. "But then," he continued, approaching her slowly, "you appeared with your silent dignity, your discreet strength, and destroyed all my defenses without even trying. I chose you thinking I would be immune to you, but now—" His voice broke slightly. "Now I fear I need you more than I need air to breathe." Remedios felt hot tears stream down her cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness, but of recognition. Two wounded souls who had found healing in each other. "Evaristo," she said, standing and walking to him, "I also have something to confess." He waited, barely breathing. "All my life I believed I was invisible because I didn't deserve to be seen, that my mark, my limp, made me unworthy of love." Her voice gained strength with each word. "But you made me understand I was wrong. I wasn't invisible. I was just waiting for the right eyes to see me." When they embraced there, in the library, lit only by candles, it wasn't with the unbridled passion of romantic tales, but with a deep tenderness born of mutual recognition. They were two people who had carried wounds for so long they forgot what it was like to live without them, finding in each other the possibility of healing. May I go to your room tonight?" he asked, his voice still hesitant. "Yes," she replied simply, and in that simple word was all the promise of a new beginning. That night, for the first time, they didn't sleep in separate rooms, and although nothing was rushed or desperate, it was true. Two souls finally finding each other after a lifetime of solitude. What flowers would bloom from that love planted in previously arid ground? Autumn arrived at the hacienda with its golden colors and promise of harvest. The months following the night of confessions brought a visible transformation, not only in the relationship between Don Evaristo and Remedios, but in the entire atmosphere of the property. It was as if the house had awakened from a long sleep, breathing again with the life that true love can bring. They began traveling together through Don Evaristo's properties, visiting other farms and the peasants who worked his lands. Remedios discovered she possessed a natural talent for administration and genuine compassion for workers that won the instant loyalty of all. "The Marchioness has a heart of gold," said Pilar, one of the oldest peasant women, while Remedios examined the woman's sick child. "She doesn't mind getting her hands dirty or sitting in a simple hut. She's a true lady." Don Evaristo observed these interactions with a mixture of pride and growing admiration. The woman he had chosen for being safe revealed herself day by day to be more fascinating, more essential to his happiness than he had ever imagined possible. It was on a November afternoon while they traversed the golden vineyards for the last harvest of the year that Remedios made the announcement that would change everything. "Evaristo, I need to tell you something." There was something different. In her voice, a new softness that made him stop their ride and turn all his attention to her. "I'm expecting a child," she said simply, her hands instinctively resting on her still flat belly. The silence that followed was absolute. Don Evaristo dismounted as if in a trance and walked to her, his eyes seeking confirmation on her face for something that seemed too good to be true. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday." Then he did something completely unexpected. He knelt right there in the vineyard earth and kissed her hands with a reverence that touched the sacred. "You gave me back life," he murmured against her palms. "And now you give me even more life." The news spread through the hacienda like fire in dry straw. Doña Asunción, who had been observing her daughter's transformation with a mixture of amazement and belated pride, embraced Remedios with tears in her eyes. "Forgive me," whispered the mother. "Forgive an old fool who didn't know how to see what she had before her eyes." Even Visitación, when she learned the news in Madrid, sent a congratulatory letter, cold, formal, but devoid of the usual malice. It was as if Remedios's impending motherhood had finally established her victory unquestionably. In the main hall's piano, which had remained silent for years, the melodies Don Evaristo played in his youth began to sound again. Music of joy, of hope, of a future opening before them full of possibilities. One afternoon, while Remedios embroidered baby clothes on the sunny veranda, Don Evaristo announced a surprise. "I'm having something special built for you." "What is it?" she asked, intrigued. "A greenhouse, the largest and most beautiful in all Castilla. I want you to have a place where you can cultivate your camellias year-round, where our child can grow among flowers." Construction began the same month, and soon the hacienda buzzed with stonemasons, carpenters, and glaziers from distant places. The greenhouse would be a magnificent structure of iron and crystal, oriented to capture the best sunlight, with special beds for each type of plant. "It's my gift of love," he said one night, while they watched workers laboring under lantern light. "My recognition that you brought permanent spring to my life." Remedios rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the baby move gently in her womb. In a few months, she would be a mother. The woman who had always been considered invisible now carried the future in her body, loved by a man who had learned to see beauty where others saw only imperfections. What kind of person would this child be who would grow in a home where love had been conquered through patience and truth? The spring of 1854 arrived with an intensity that seemed to reflect the profound transformations that had occurred at the hacienda. The gardens bloomed with renewed vigor, camellias burst forth in an explosion of colors, and the greenhouse, finally completed, rose like a crystal palace where Remedios spent her mornings tending seedlings that arrived from all over Spain. Her belly had grown round and firm, and she now walked with the special dignity of women who carry life. Don Evaristo observed her with a devotion that bordered on reverence, as if she were a living work of art he feared to touch with too much force. It was on an April morning, when pearls of dew still trembled on rose petals, that news arrived. That would change everything. Doña Asunción had fallen gravely ill during the night. The village doctor, called in haste, was clear in his diagnosis: a lung infection spreading rapidly. At 52, after a life of resistance and pride, the Countess's body was finally yielding. Remedios remained by her mother's side during the 3 days of agony. Doña Asunción, lucid despite the pain, used her last strength for a confession she had kept for decades. "My daughter," she whispered, her voice weak as wind through dry leaves, "I committed a terrible injustice against you. I made you live in shadow because I feared your difference was a reflection of my failure as a mother." Remedios held her mother's cold hand, feeling the baby move in her womb, as if it too wanted to participate in that moment of reconciliation. "I was wrong," continued Doña Asunción, tears streaming down her sunken cheeks. "You were always stronger, wiser, more worthy than any of us. Forgive an old fool who didn't know how to love you as you deserved." "I forgave long ago, Mama," replied Remedios, kissing the feverish forehead. "Rest now." Doña Asunción died at dawn of the 3rd day, when the first rays of golden sun touched her room's windows. Her last breath was soft as a prayer, and Remedios closed her eyes with the tenderness she had never received in life, but could offer in death. The funeral was simple, as befitted a family that had learned to value substance over ostentation. Visitación arrived from Madrid dressed in strict mourning, but there was something different about her, a sobriety that their mother's loss had brought, a belated understanding that life is too brief for petty disputes. "Forgive me too, Remedios," she said after the ceremony, her words laden with genuine repentance. "I was cruel because I envied something I didn't understand at the time." "What did you envy?" asked Remedios gently. "Your inner peace, your ability to be happy without needing others' approval." The two sisters embraced there in the village cemetery, under the blue April sky, and something that had broken in childhood was finally repaired. Visitación departed for Madrid the next day, but now she carried with her not the bitter taste of defeat, but a melancholic acceptance that some destinies are better than others, and that perhaps she had chosen the wrong path by always seeking to shine instead of simply being. On the return to the hacienda, Don Evaristo and Remedios stopped by the oak, where they had exchanged their first confessions of affection. She was now in her 8th month of pregnancy, and the baby moved constantly, as if wanting to participate in every moment of its mother's life. "Are you sad about the loss?" he asked, observing the clouds forming on the horizon. "Sad for the woman she could have been if she hadn't been so afraid," replied Remedios, "but grateful for the forgiveness we could exchange before it was too late. And now we await our child and build the future they couldn't see." A gentle breeze swayed the oak leaves, as if the tree itself agreed with her words. Life continued, bringing with it the promise of renewal that only true love can offer. What kind of world would receive the child born from a union that began without love but found it along the way? 10 years had passed since that spring of 1854, and Hacienda Voldemar had transformed into an unrecognizable place. Remedios's greenhouse had become famous throughout Castilla, attracting visitors from distant places who came to admire the rare varieties of camellias she had managed to cultivate. But more than that, it had become a symbol of how patient love can make beauty flourish in the most unexpected places. On the golden September morning of 1863, Remedios walked through the gardens in the company of her 3 children. Esperanza, the 9-year-old firstborn, had inherited her mother's contemplative seriousness, but with a confidence Remedios had never possessed in childhood. Crisanto, 7 years old, was a young version of his father. Observant, intelligent, but with a smile Don Evaristo had only learned to give after marriage. And little Milagros, only 4 years old, hopped among the flowers like a butterfly, her crystalline laughter echoing through the garden paths. "Mama, why are these camellias different?" asked Esperanza, pointing to a variety of white flowers with pink edges. "Because they're the result of grafting, my dear. 2 different plants that united to create something new and beautiful." The answer carried a symbolism the girl didn't yet fully understand. But that would one day make sense when she herself understood how 2 apparently incompatible beings can unite to create something more beautiful than the sum of their parts. Don Evaristo observed the scene from the veranda, where he took his morning coffee. At 48 years old, there were completely silver threads in his hair, but his eyes had lost that coldness that had characterized them. Now they shone with the deep satisfaction of a man who had found his reason for existing. Remedios approached him, now at 36 years old, with some silver threads also adorning her brown hair. The mark on her face remained, but it was no longer something that embarrassed her. It had become part of her identity, a mark of uniqueness that distinguished her, and that Don Evaristo had learned to kiss with tenderness during intimate moments. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, sitting beside him. "About how different this house was when I arrived here 10 years ago. It seemed like a mausoleum where people existed, but didn't live. And now? Now it's a home where love can be breathed in every corner." The children ran to them, Milagros bringing a disheveled bouquet of daisies she had picked in the field. "For Mama!" she shouted, offering the flowers with the carefree generosity of childhood. Remedios accepted the gift with the seriousness it deserved, inhaling the gentle perfume of the flowers. "They're the most beautiful I've ever received," she said, and she wasn't lying. That afternoon, while the children napped after lunch, Don Evaristo and Remedios visited the small library where it all had begun. At the desk, she still kept the first note he had written her. "You are not insignificant. I am the one who didn't know how to look." "Do you still remember?" he asked, watching her leaf through the paper yellowed by time. "I remember every word, every gesture. I remember the day I discovered I existed in your eyes. And I remember the day I discovered I didn't just want to exist, I wanted to live, and I only learned how to do that by your side." They embraced there in the library where they had exchanged their first confessions, but now with the tranquility of those who know that true love doesn't need grand gestures to prove itself. Only constant presence, mutual care, and the willingness to grow together through the years. When the sun set behind the hills of Castilla, tinting the sky with tones of gold and crimson, the family gathered in the greenhouse for the evening ritual of watering the plants. It was a sacred moment where even the children moved with reverence among the flowers that had witnessed the growth of their family. "These camellias came from Galicia," Remedios explained to her children, "and those from Andalusia. Each brought with it the story of its homeland, but all found a new home here." "Like Papa and Mama?" asked Crisanto, with the insight he had already shown since childhood. "Exactly like Papa and Mama," confirmed Don Evaristo, kissing the top of the boy's head. When the family returned to the house for dinner, Remedios lingered a moment among the camellias. She gently touched a pink flower blooming in perfect beauty, remembering the girl she had been, always living in shadows, always considering herself unworthy of love. Now she was a mother, beloved wife, respected lady of a great property. But more than that, she was a woman who had learned the most precious secret of all. That true beauty doesn't reside in perfection, but in the capacity to love and be loved for who we really are. The camellias would continue blooming every year, silent witnesses to a love that grew from convenience to necessity, from necessity to devotion, and from devotion to the silent eternity of hearts that found in each other their true home. And on spring nights, when the wind blew gently through the Hacienda gardens, one could hear the whisper of flowers telling stories of patient love, of hidden beauty that waited to be discovered, and of how 2 wounded souls can heal each other. When they find sufficient courage to lower their defenses and let love enter, The invisible woman had finally become the most visible of all, not in the world's eyes, but in the only eyes that truly mattered, those of the one who knew how to love her for the person she had always been.